Cool. So, very welcome here, Patrick.
Thank you.
I've known you for some time, and we often are on similar kind of events and speaking about AI in different ways.
Right.
And I'm really glad to have you here. I think you are one of the more powerful and experienced speakers out there that can make complicated things sound understandable.
I do my best.
Okay, so we had a little discussion before about very interesting topics like psychedelics and philosophy and things that I really enjoy and love to hear more about. But perhaps we can start by just giving a quick background about yourself. Who is Patrick Couch?
Yeah, sure, certainly. So I'm Patrick Couch. I currently work for IBM. I specialize in business development for artificial intelligence. So I basically help customers drive value out of that. But I came to this field sort of through a series of crooked paths, I guess. I studied philosophy, literature, literary theory, German philosophy at the university. And that sort of made me write this master thesis on the literature of William Gibson. Uh-huh. So I wrote...
How long ago was that?
I was at the Stockholm University in the middle of the 90s. Mm. So I wrote my master thesis maybe 94 or something like that. Mm. And it was a look at William Gibson's fiction, especially Neuromancer, in terms of human-machine boundary blurring as a plot device. Uh-huh. And I was thinking I was going to pursue a academic career, and sort of I went on to pursue a PhD. Mm. But then sort of at the end of the 90s, the .com era just got ushered in, and all of a sudden all of my friends that were at sort of business school, they started up companies, and they were all like .com companies. And it was sort of time for me to take a breather from academics. So I ended up in Stockholm working for this small little startup, and that was sort of my entry point into the wonderful world of IT. But I've always been very interested in technology and especially the internet. I mean, I think I'm born in the 70s, and I think a lot of us got really fascinated when the internet started becoming real. Some of us had been early out on like bulletin boards, and I benefited from having...
Did you have the modems as well?
I had the modems, absolutely. And I had an older brother who was very early on the bulletin boards. Yeah. And when these early web browsers came out, like Gopher and Netscape. Well. Oh yeah. No, I was early out there, and it was just fascinating to me. And I immediately understood the potential of it, and I actually immediately sort of made use of it in my research. So when I wrote that master thesis on Neuromancer, the first thing I did was go and identify a digital copy of the book, so that I could download it off of one of these bulletin boards and query the text.
All right.
So I could sort of use a digital version of that piece of literature, and that was very helpful because I immediately understood that I can do analytics on the text itself, and that can sort of make my research more effective. So then I sort of transitioned over into the world of IT, and I haven't really made my way back. But the funny thing with that is, now with IBM and the current role that I have, it has sort of come full circle. So a lot of the things that I was sort of looking at from a literary theory perspective has become sort of reality. And so reality has sort of caught up with the fiction, and I find the whole thing very fascinating.
I can imagine you wish you had IBM Watson Analytics available at your math thesis work, right?
Yeah, that would have been great. That would have been great. But it's really fascinating the way fiction can sort of establish like a target for reality to create. So I think a lot of the people that read Neuromancer in the middle of the 80s when it was published, and in that book you have William Gibson coined the term cyberspace. Oh, yeah. And I think a lot of people that read that, they just said, hey, that's a great idea. Let's go create that. And then they were really already at it, of course. I mean, this was middle of the 80s. But still, I think fiction can, if powerful fiction will move you, and it will move you into action. And I think that's what we're seeing. And now the whole thing has just taken off and become a beast on its own.
Yeah, an interesting background, as I said. And how did that proceed? What was the company you started working with again?
Yeah, so the company I started with was called Versus Market. And it was this brainchild of these guys, these friends of mine. And it was about financial betting, like online gambling in the financial services. So it was basically a offering to people to sort of gamify stock trading.
Yeah.
So you were sort of you were pitching stocks against stocks, and depending on who performed the better, you had a winner. So it wasn't really about like the actual. Like it wasn't like investing in stocks, but it was more like putting money on stocks as you would on horses or any other sort of head-to-head competition. And that was great. I mean, I learned a tremendous amount at that company. And like so many other companies in that era, when the Twin Towers came down, the whole market just went kapow. And that company eventually went bankrupt as well.
What do you think about the stock market, the way it's working today, and the high frequency trading and that type of processes?
I think that there was a very interesting picture floating around the internet a couple of months back in light of this whole COVID situation, where you saw there was a screen dump of some news broadcast, and I'm sure we can fetch that up. But you saw the massive unemployment numbers, and sort of in the those what are they called, the things that sort of pass by on the screen.
Yeah, the subtext
or something. And then on the screen behind the news anchor, there was the stock market like going, like shooting through the roof, right? So when I saw that, it was like, that's what's wrong with the stock market. You can have a complete financial sort of personal financial crisis for a lot of people, but still the stock market can perform. And so you have a disconnect between like real world economics and the financial speculative stock market. And then we see this again and again, where we have the valuation of stocks reflecting psychology or people's beliefs rather than the real world value that certain companies provide. So I'm not a big fan of that dynamic. I think it's an unfortunate one. I think there will be alternatives to that as we mature into the digital age.
So do you think AI will be like a positive or negative impact on how the stock markets will work in like 5-10 years?
Well,
Let's imagine you had someone that can understand text to a much higher degree than AI could in 10 years back. And
so I don't know. I mean, this is perhaps a question maybe more for economists, but my thinking is that a lot of the great thing that AI can do is it can optimize suboptimal systems and processes. It could just like hit the index basically. And so I'm thinking if you have more information processed, you will have a better, more close to reality, so evaluation of, say, risk, performance, benefit, and those things. And in that sense, I think that potentially artificial intelligence can bring to the stock market a sense of grounding in more facts, and sort of move away slightly from that gut feeling approach of like maverick traders, like, yeah, let's do this. So
less speculation, you think, in the future with more intelligence in
I'm a positive guy. I mean, that's what I'm hoping for, and maybe that's sort of clouding my judgment, but I think it can have a good, healthy impact on financial trading, actually.
I think so too. Cool.
Yeah.
And welcome, Henrik, as
well. Hi,
guys.
Here's the real rock star coming late. Coming in from Värmdö, and it's shit traffic. What can we do about AI in traffic? Come on.
Yeah. Well, first we have to build out the Skurubron, right?
Yeah, that's what this is going right now. There's a lot of building on this one place bridge from Värmdö back into the town, and they've been starting to do the construction work for for this bridge. I guess that's what's slowing everything up. So
yeah, it is. And I mean, I was born and raised out in Nacka, just by the Skurubron.
oh, you're my way. Where
So
you're born.
I was raised in Lilla Björknäs.
And we go soccer at the Bo Arena with the kids.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when I grew up there, I was living in an area where we were like the only ones living there year round. It was like a summer house type place. We were like, it was us and another family and maybe some older guy. And today that's completely different, right? So now the houses are bigger than the lots that they built on there. And it has just gentrified completely, and it's just a different place. And I think that has then caused the need for a bigger Skurubron. But what I think is needed is just a reworking of how we think about moving matter around in terms of the job and the workplace. And I think if you want to fix transportation, I think you should just decrease the need for it. You know,
it's like they say, the best energy or the cheapest energy or transportation is the one you don't use.
Right? Exactly. And I think this whole working from home, COVID times has shown that maybe we don't need to move around so much. I mean, we certainly benefit from having a social, real world context, and it's great. But I think just look at the climatological impact of transportation. I mean, it's not sustainable. So I think the future's transportation is less need of it and more clever use of the immaterial aspects of why you travel. Like, why do you go there? What is the purpose of that? Can you create another situation different from the one that you have today? So I think this whole electric mobility thing, the more lighter touch on the vessels used or the vehicles used is the right approach. I think building out digital infrastructures is a good thing, and so on and on and on. I think there are a lot of different technologies that can be brought to bear to just decrease the need for moving stuff around. 3D printing is this great fun thing that if it were to deliver on its promise, it would just be fantastic. Maybe it won't, but
I think this is, from a data and AI perspective, also really, really interesting how we see these fundamental mega trends of real things we need to change: our energy systems, our transport systems, our public sector, and everything. I want to test this idea with you. I think what happens is that these fundamental areas is sort of also driving fundamental ecosystems in the future. And with an ecosystem, actually, it's data that needs to flow, algorithms that needs to flow. So to rethink transport, is to rethink the whole ecosystem around transportation, both goods, people, the infrastructure in terms of what trains we have and all that, and planning. But isn't this also an ecosystem topic that really closely is connected to how data can flow and how algorithms can flow to optimize these ecosystems?
Oh, absolutely. And I think optimization is the key here. And like we said earlier, I think that a lot of the artificial intelligence algorithmic approaches to tackling problems points to a clever way of doing something completely differently, but maybe with the same targeted outcome. So, for instance, you know how people say, but your car is used 20% of its time or something. You have it parked at the office, in the garage, at home, or whatever, and so you have this tons of material that you require to just move yourself. You're 70 kilos of flesh around. And
Thank you.
and you put yourself in this 1.5 ton thing, and it's just nonsensical, right? Why would you want to do that? And the reason for that is, previously it was like the best way of doing it. Like, to have a car and just build roads was great. Then you could all of a sudden have free movement in a way you hadn't had before. You could reach greater distances than you could before. But in the wake of that, you have cities that are just uninhabitable. So it has come at a cost. And I think, again, I saw this article many years ago. I think it was a study, not a study, but there was a piece published by the Singularity University about what if you were to have autonomous driving as a reality on Manhattan. What would it mean?
What would that mean?
And it meant basically that you could do away with 90% of the vehicles. So if you remove 90% of the vehicles from Manhattan, all of a sudden Manhattan becomes a very attractive place to hang around in, because there's a lot of awesome stuff there, but it's just not okay right now because of traffic, basically. So Manhattan is an island for cars, not for people. But if you could change that, and I think we're seeing that. I saw just earlier today there was a post by Erik Givmark, I think his name is. He works for Volvo in one of the like brands there, and they're doing a really interesting research thing at Helsingegatan to see, together with Vinnova and some other actors, how you can rethink inner city mobility and traffic. So I think there is a great need for just rethinking the whole thing and not just continuing in the same way but tweaking it. But I think we need to shatter it, basically.
But then from a data and AI perspective, to get the real potential, what this is all about, there is actually a quite big need for us to then take the step of slapping data and AI on top of old analog processes or the way we used to do it, and fundamentally rethink the whole process with a data and AI first mindset. So it's a little bit like you will never get to the 10x ambition if you're not concretely rethinking the whole process from scratch, what you're highlighting now.
Right, I think you're absolutely right. And I think Tesla is showing precisely this. I mean, they have basically all the Tesla cars out there form this ecosystem of Teslas. Mm-hmm. And all the data is flowing across that entire ecosystem. And the learnings and the capabilities coming out of that are massive because they form an ecosystem of cars. And they don't just form a large fleet of cars that don't have anything to sort of teach each other. So I think it is very interesting with a connected, data-rich and data-fueled approach to transportation, for instance.
We always end up at Tesla somehow.
We've been there now a couple of sessions, like with Mikael, we talked about this also. Actually, of course, the after work always continues after the show is off. And I'm sorry, guys, the best discussions were actually at 9 o'clock. My wife was killing me because I was supposed to be home at 9. But we talked about this, and we also talk about this first principle is something that came up. And but we had a much better conversation about what first principle is if we talk about it from a business sort of, what's your first principle as a business, what your core idea of value is. And when we actually relate it back to technology, the engineering perspective of first principle.
Do you have any view of what does a first principle mean for you?
Well, Marshall McLuhan wrote a very interesting book in the 60s called Understanding Media. And in the preface of that book, he mentions IBM. And this is like, I think it is, it's middle 60s. And he writes, when IBM understood it was in the business of processing information, it had its course set. And now it seems self-evident. But I think for him to spot that in the 60s, that it's about information processing, was very astute. And I think that is sort of one way of formulating a first principle. Like we're in the business of information here, guys. That's what we do. And
this was Klingvall's angle. You have exactly the same understanding of first principle as Mikael Klingvall, who's a data scientist. And
so something about sticking to the vision, so to speak, and having the right vision from the start in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's sort of, we spoke about philosophy earlier, and I find it very interesting. And, the Greeks had that know thyself motto, and the British Romanticists sort of embraced that. But I think that urge, or not the urge, but that the endeavor of knowing yourself, that reflective effort, I think, is very valuable. And when companies do that properly, you can have this self-understanding of your business and what your value is to really play an important role in how you then make money off your business. But if you don't understand what you're doing, then you may sort of self-identify with something that then doesn't have sustainability over time. So think of Volvo, for instance. Volvo is no longer a Swedish company, but they retain that detail made by Sweden, right? And then I remember I was in this panel discussion with a senior person from Volvo, and she was saying that, well, at Volvo we're working with this. We're trying to embrace the idea that we may not be working with selling cars anymore, and that's a tough swallow for a lot of people. But today I saw that Volvo has this idea of by, I forget, 2030 or something, they will have 50% of their cars on subscription. So half of the fleet, half of the cars out there that are Volvo cars aren't sold cars. So what is your business? Do you sell cars? Well, no, you don't. So what do you do? And then if you just reflect upon what you actually do, then you will sort of be able to do that thing. You will stick to the first principle, but it will look differently over time depending on, market dynamics and other things.
But Anders, I really want to have your engineering point of view on first principle, because I think this is really vital as well in this kind of innovation
it would have been fun to hear you reflect on, if you take the first principle approach, but from a technology point of view instead of a business point of view, and just see if you apply that for IBM, would that be appropriate or not? Or Volvo, I really like what you said about, changing, instead of selling cars or even selling a service, you actually sell a function. And this is the circular economy kind of thinking that perhaps is changing the first principle in some way. But from a technology point of view, and going back to Elon perhaps, and thinking Tesla or thinking SpaceX or SolarCity, I think SpaceX perhaps is the best explanation for it. And they want to build rockets, and then they look at, how does it work today? And then you can say, okay, let's do like other people do, and just to try to improve the process a bit. Or you go to the core physical principles of how rockets work and rethink, is this really the right way to do it? Is it really right to build a rocket and then just throw it away when you use it once? Or can you actually land it again and try to have it, being reused, and in that way reduce the cost significantly? And then just thinking that through, going back to the original part, how do you actually build this? What are the physical laws making a rocket work? And why can't you land it? And just, really question the normality, the normal way of doing things, and instead of thinking about, how does it really work? And I guess that's the way Elon at least thinks about first principle as well as I understand it, at least. What's your thought about that from a technology point of view?
It certainly makes sense, and I think that would, if we were so inclined, invite us to discuss quantum computing, right? Because quantum is a completely different way of attacking computation, and it's much more closer to the perhaps bedrock, if there is such a thing, of reality, right? You start with the atoms and say, okay, how are they behaving? Where are they behaving? Like, can we manipulate them? And then what will come out of that? So it certainly makes sense to me to always question, what is the first principle, or what's the are you familiar with biomimicry?
No, not really.
It's like this discipline of trying to stand up nature-like or biology-like approaches to problems. And there's a lot of interesting benefit from that, because in nature you will see biological processes performing very well, but at a much lower energy consumption. So if we were to think of say the human brain, right? And if you want to stand up a technology equivalent of the human brain today with the computational means available, probably the energy consumption would be rather large, and it would just not simply be possible. So you have to find another way, but apparently there is another way, because nature has another way. It doesn't work through combustion engines or electricity. It has, it does different things for different purposes, and it's sort of a low energy, clever approach to things, and it has perfected its method over millennia through the process of evolution, natural selection, and what else comes to play. And I think so biomimicry is this idea to try and sort of understand nature more closely and then mimic it.
I really like the idea of being, questioning and having critical mindset and really thinking, why do we need to do it this way?
Right.
And the better understanding you have of the core principles, I think the easier it is to question, why something is done in a certain way, right?
Right, and it's very easy to sort of fall back to anthropomorphic approaches, right? And we think about, we need to stand up robots that look like humans, but really, if you want to automate the washing of the dishes, you don't create a humanoid robot that does the dishes and using hands or stuff like that. You invent the washing machine, and that's done, right? Or as the French poet Apollinaire said, when man wanted to invent a faster way of moving, it created the wheel. It didn't sort of add more legs or bigger legs or stronger legs. It just legs. What about the wheel? The wheel's a good thing, and then boom, and we have bicycles and cars.
And I read somewhere quite recently this quite interesting example of this. Like you put man on a map of who is who is using the least amount of energy while they're traveling 1 kilometer. And then you have much more efficient animals in the animal kingdom. So we are quite mediocre in terms of how much energy we use to travel 1 kilometer. But just to make the whole point of first principle or rethinking or innovation, when they did the calculation, then they put the man riding a bicycle doing 1 kilometer. And of course, the man on the bicycle blows all the animals out of the water in terms of energy efficiency. So it's a very simple telling example of what we are talking about here.
Absolutely. And I think every child who gets on a bike will just be enamored and just seduced by what happens when you pedal, because you seem to get more out of it than you put in.
And this is also then, we are able to use tools to rethink the fundamentals of what we're trying to do. But I think this almost like philosophical question, and now we have spent quite a bit of time on first principle. Let's bring that home now, even to what I was working on today, and a little bit why I'm late. So I've been working right now on topics of basically how do you set the 10x ambition in an operational setting, right? So we're talking about processes, we are talking about rethinking with data and AI, the way we have done things in a typical administrative process. Now we truly need to apply first principle ideas on very fundamental stuff. So how do you go about to manage a contract with a customer? How do you go about the stuff that allows, we are managing the contract, but someone else needs to sell it. And if you really look closely at what we've been doing and how our computerization works right now, it's an analog process in the end that we have done, perfected over 50 years. It's pretty good, but it's still an analog process that we are computerizing or putting things on top of like this. And ultimately now, if I go into the mindset, how someone says, this is ridiculous. How can you do 10x on this process? We've been trying to make it lean forever. Well, I don't really need to do it like that, because I realize it's the same data that you collect here that I need over here, and I realized it's just a bunch of business rules, and they're actually not even that advanced. They're not even that, knowledge-intensive business rules. So what if I automate that, and then use a combination of the right techniques, workflow automation, stuff like this? It is actually not rocket science to take a contract management process from 2 weeks to 2 minutes. It is really not, if you have the know-how, of course.
Yeah, and not only the know-how, but if you also have sort of the conditions in place to leverage. And I think the digital infrastructure is very good at that. It's sort of, once you go digital, all bets are off. In terms of what was the tried and tested truths of yesteryear. So how people tend to distinguish between digitization and digitalization, and they want to say, well, if you just stand up the same thing digitally, you haven't done anything, but you need to sort of rethink processing. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So if you think of not the easiest, but not sounding negative, but the simplest way of process automation is sort of screen scraping solutions. You replicate.
Don't use the term that I know you're thinking about, but I hate personally, so don't say it.
Don't use 3-letter words that start with R.
but so there's a lot of course, there's a lot of benefit from that. If you can move away the human from the keyboard or the mouse and sort of have this manipulate the cursor on the screen in an automated way. I mean, that's more efficient, but it comes up at this hurdle. We're up against this hurdle where it's sort of you optimize or you make it lean 100% within the confines of the same constraints that you worked with before. But if you re-engineer the entire process, you say you don't need to click like that. You don't need to have folder structures like that. You don't need to have that because you don't need to have the human in the loop.
No,
you don't need to make the process manipulation visible to the human eye in an understandable way in real time. You can just do it completely differently. Then you will have 10 or 100 times, many times the factor of impact in terms of efficiency, potentially.
But I think now we're also getting into the real unleashing of 10x effect or automation or rethink first principle. You really need to rethink the infrastructure stack, because what you're dealing with is an application-centric stack where the application is in the center, and then you can do this scraping and putting a shell on top of that, but you haven't really gained anything. But if you rethink the fundamentals of how you do your data management and how data is the core center part and how you build platforms of use around using data, then you end up with a fundamentally different design.
Absolutely, and I think to turn this conversation or to continue this conversation in the light of artificial intelligence, you can think of what Google did with the Go playing games. And when they stood up AlphaGo, and they began with this experience-based approach, and they basically taught the AI how to play Go based on all the thousands of years people have been playing Go. And it had access to all these great Go players, and it played against the experts, and it was reading the textbooks and the tactics and all of that stuff, and it was great and it was successful, right? It beat Lee Sedol. And then Google went another way and said, well, let's not tell the AI how to play Go. Let's just say, these are the rules. Now you go figure out how to play this game the best way. And then boom, now it's impossible for humans to beat computers playing Go. Because some of the moves are just not in the textbook. It's not in the experience of the human field in terms of people having played it before. And I think there was that move, the hand of God move.
Exactly.
And so I think it's really interesting. I mean, when people talk about being data-driven, that is precisely rethinking and re-engineering approaches or solutions to problems.
And don't just put like a coat on top of some existing process that does exist and try to make it stronger in somehow. It's like taking a goat and you just put a suit on it, or you put like robotic arms on a goat. It's still a goat. So you can only do smaller incremental improvements in the speed he can move, but if you remove the goat and replace it with some like a horse,
this is the difference between slapping data and AI or digital on top of an analog process, further go back to first principle and rethink now, what is data management all about? If I'm needing to manage data, not so I can code myself, but I free up the data. I give the computer the rule book, and then he can write the software himself, so to speak. I mean, I think this dimension of machine learning and AI also as a new coding paradigm, I'm not sure how well understood that is. What's your take on that? Do people understand this difference in coding? Fundamentally, that we don't need to code every single business rule, but we give instructions and data.
Yeah, I think that the data science community, and you know this much better than I do, I think is very sophisticated when it comes to this. But I think maybe the some of the business owners or lines of businesses type people that aren't comfortable with this data-driven approach to solutions will want to ensure control of behavior through rule-based approaches or programmatic approaches, because it becomes too weird, sort of as a cultural approach to a problem to say, well, we don't really know how we're going to tackle this. Let's just have the AI fight it out and see what it comes up with, and we'll pick the best thing. And people are uncomfortable with that, but I do see it moving into that area. especially, primarily, I think, because the compute power is so massive now that you can actually do brute force approaches with very interesting outcomes, and then sort of pick out of that sort of brute force effort where you just iterate like mad some really clever, innovative, new ways of approaching things. And then you just discard all that iteration, and then you make use of that gold nugget that you get.
There's so many interesting questions here that we can continue with, and just saying makes things stronger. We had discussion today at work with GPT-3 and stuff like that, so it would be interesting.
Talk about GPT-3.
Before perhaps we go into that, and it would also be awesome to hear what is really intelligence and your view on that. And IBM has previously used term like cognitive intelligence, and what's the potential difference. But we interrupted actually the background about you as well, so I think we came to the point where you started this company that basically gamified stock trading in some way, and what happened after that, and how did you get started at IBM?
Yeah, right. So I when the stock market came down, the Twin Towers came down, the new economy turned out to be bound by certain constraints similar to the old economy. There was basically for myself personally. Then what happened was that since I had then spent a lot of time, a couple of years, in this company, which was an online betting company, the learnings from that. Eventually put me at the Swedish horse betting company ATG,
right?
Because at this time, this was early 2000. There was then a discussion of a deregulation of the gambling market in the Nordics and in Sweden, which has now sort of happened, but it was discussed then. And ATG was a very traditional horse betting company with most betting done at the tracks. And they realized that, okay, if external player comes in, actors come in, and the digital online betting takes off, then we are exposed. So we need to get young kids in and help us figure out how to sort of think about this. So I was recruited into ATG, and I was working with analytics there to try and sort of help them better become sort of data driven. And it was quite successful. So ATG sort of managed to really make good on the value of digitalization for them. So they
Digitization, perhaps
they did that too. Absolutely. But what they understood was that they could take the track and they could turn that track into a digital experience by simply offering up the live feeds, because they had their own media company, Kanal 75. So they basically offered up the live stream to the online world. And then all of a sudden, boom.
Typical digitalization then.
Yeah, so then the track, the betting on the track went down, but in overall turnover it went up. So that was a clever move. And then, so I was working with that, with a couple of really, really clever people over there. And then one thing led to the other, and at some point I got this call from this recruiter saying that there was this company wanting to have a chat, and I was like, okay. And then it turned out it was IBM. And I was like, what, IBM? And this was 2010. And at that time, although I had been in the IT business for 10 years and I'd been doing fairly advanced information analytics stuff, IBM wasn't on my radar really as a company of great interest for what, in terms of what I was sort of looking for in terms of advanced analytics and really sort of refined ways of working with information. But that turned out to be sort of just a misconception on my part, because this was sort of around the time that IBM started looking into artificial intelligence more explicitly, and they formed the Watson Group as a business unit, and then 2011 I think was the Gepardy, the Watson Gepardy Challenge. So it turned out to be a very interesting company to get on board at that time.
So that the Gepardy thing is super interesting and would be very interesting to hear more about. But they had a business unit for Watson before the Gepardy channel.
Yeah, they did. So they formed. No, that's incorrect on my part. I think the Watson Challenge was in 2011. I think maybe the Watson Group was formally formed as a business unit in 2013.
Okay.
But anyway, there was a lot of talk about Watson when we banged the drum on the Gepardy challenge. And IBM has this tradition of posing themselves grand challenges. And of course, Google now sort of co-opted that term. They talk about the moon shots. But it's really like an IBM approach, I think, to tackling really, really, really interesting problems. And of course, landing on the moon was a grand challenge. Beating Kasparov at chess was a grand challenge. And Watson was a very, very grand challenge. And the way to test what can be done with language-based processing and sort of mimicking human language, and what then became, the whole field of natural language processing and natural language understanding was sort of ushered in, I think, by IBM with that Watson Gepardy challenge, because it was so amazing and it was so out of there.
I mean, this is such an interesting thing, and perhaps we should just dig a bit deeper into
Let's
it.
go
Since
here.
Sure.
We have to. When we have this guy who knows the story from the inside, it's really cool.
But I certainly agree. There are a number of seminal moments in AI, and I think the Gepardy challenge was one. I think the Deep Blue, when they beat Kasparov, was another. How would you rate those two in the IBM history of AI as, like, which one was the greater challenge to actually overcome?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'd be reluctant to sort of pitch the two against each other, because it's difficult. Once something is shown to be possible, you forget how tough it was to actually try it. So,
and just for people that perhaps not know about these, Kasparov and Deep Blue, that was in 97, right?
Yeah,
and
96, 97.
Yeah, and when I hear about this, some people come up to me and say, Deep Blue didn't have AI at all. What's your reply to that?
Yeah, so that, I guess, brings us back to the definition of intelligence. Yes. And I know there's a lot of nitpicking when it comes to that term. I stick to a very, very homemade definition of artificial intelligence, and that is, it is, to me, it is intelligence without biology. That's it. That's the only definition I stick to when it comes to
then
artificial
intelligence. Then you have to know what intelligence is, right?
Yes, and then people say, oh, but that doesn't give us anything, right? And then, so when I'm asked, and I think you were at that event where we were both participating, and that at that event there was this guy who said, because I had misunderstood something. But basically, there was a case, a ruling in the U.S., like a pornography case, and there was a famous quote by the judge of that case on pornography, and he said, well, I can't give you a definition of pornography, but I recognize it when I see it.
Good.
Right.
Like it.
And I have taken that to heart. And to me, that is true of art. Like, what is art? You define art, and good luck with that. I stick to Marcel Duchamp, who says, well, art is what I say it is.
I have a very controversial definition, but I won't say it.
No, please.
No, go on.
No. But we don't talk more now, because me and Goran is so upset when this guy comes up with, and he does it afterwards when we have a couple of beers. So now I'm going to put you on the spot. I want you to push this, Anders. Come on. Oh, you don't like this. He doesn't like it. Sorry, man.
I don't want to take too much time here. I mean, it's really Patrick that's we're going to speak about. But the very short version is it's a work that you don't have any use for.
That's all.
But I agree with that. I think that is precisely it, right? Art is an extremely interesting topic, and I think it is really, really, really important for programmers, coders, developers to think of themselves as artists and alchemists. And if they don't do that, they are selling themselves short, because what they're doing is short of magic. I mean, it's amazing stuff, right? They create things out of nothing. I love it, right? Yeah. And some things are certainly not useful, I guess, but maybe it is. And
it can be useful from a psychology point of view, or for perhaps not always practical reasons, but for other reasons.
Absolutely. So I sort of, to answer your question, what is intelligence? I recognize it when I see it, but I certainly I expect a couple of things to be in play. Like I expect intelligence. I expect a system that I then define as an artificial intelligence system to be context aware to some extent. I sort of, if you think of understanding as being able to put something into context, like if you have a mathematical rule, it doesn't depend on context. 2 + 2 is 4, regardless of whether it's Tuesday or Thursday or raining outside. Doesn't matter.
2 cars or 2 elephants. 2 + 2 is 4.
A little bit like that.
But 5 ants is more than 4 elements.
That's it. 5 ants is more than 4 elephants.
All right.
Yeah.
That's a very good example of.
and that's great, right? So I expect out of intelligence, I expect a sensitivity to context, understanding. I also expect a certain element of improvement over time, like an element of learning. Like if you can't change with new information, that's not intelligence. So there needs to be a learning element there.
I'm not sure if you've seen there was the founder of Keras, he recently wrote a paper last year where he tried to define intelligence. Have you seen it, or should I?
No, I haven't.
I can just recap very quickly his way of talking about intelligence and see if you agree or not with that. But the way he speaks about it is intelligence is skill acquisition efficiency. So what that means, skills can be many different things. Skills can be playing chess, it can be answer Gepardy challenges, it can be driving a car or whatnot, or playing a violin or something. It's a large number of different skills you can imagine you have or have not. And then you want to acquire it, and that can be done in a number of different ways. But usually it is because you have to get some information into your head or into the system that's going to complete some task. And the more efficiently you can acquire that information to be able to master that skill, the more intelligent you are. That's like a very short, at least, description of that. And that in some way, counters with knowledge, which is different. So you can have huge amount of knowledge, doesn't mean you're intelligent. But you can still have, be really good at the skill because you already have the knowledge. But that's not a good definition of intelligence. Intelligence is really the efficiency you can acquire a skill, so to speak. What do you think about that?
I think that makes sense to me, and it recalls something that Jack Ma of Alibaba said at Davos a couple of years back, relating to education, where he makes the case for the need for us humans to rethink our value vis-a-vis machines or technology. And he says, specifically in terms of education, that the educational systems have been a fact-based transference situation where you learn facts. So you sort of, and certainly that resonates with me. I mean, I recall when I was in school, there was a lot of premium in terms of the grades you got for stuff that you knew. If you just knew, all the lakes in Sweden or, all the capitals in the world, I mean, that was that's fantastic. You're so intelligent, but you're not. You're just stuffed with facts. Yeah. And so Jack Ma at that Davos seminar talks about, knowledge base, and how we need to move away from that, because the knowledge acquisition machines do quite well. So there's no premium for us. There's no upside for us to sort of do that. So he would certainly sort of be aligned with what you just said. And also I think, to talk a little bit about myself, when I went to school early on, like the first 3 years when I went to school, I went to a Montessori school. And so we were different aged kids, and we didn't really have a very strict curriculum. We had sort of, I mean, I was, you're 7, 8, 9, 10 sort of years old. But you had targets in terms of learning that you had to sort of take off by the end of the semester. But you could sort of go about it a little bit the way you felt. So if you wanted to practice English, or if you wanted to go into math, you could sort of spend more time on that. And then when I started mellanstadiet, like the 4th grade, we had moved. So I moved into another school, like a traditional school. And I very early on understood that I knew less than my peers, but I had learned how to learn. Right. So I was pretty good at learning stuff. And that to me then, I sort of internalized that, you're intelligent, Patrick, fantastic. But then again, so to sort of return to the implications of this, I think you can see this in the impact this has on jobs, for instance, and how premiums will shift from what has been the premium previously to what is perhaps the premium now. And I often use when I'm out talking, I use the example of doctors.
Mm-hmm.
So the medical doctor is often someone who has been to school for a long time. So it's a long and extensive knowledge, fact-based program, and you learn a lot of stuff. You learn all the Latin names of the skeletons, parts, and this and that, and you learn about diagnostics and symptoms, and you become this brain, right? But somewhere there, you sort of deprioritize the reason why you're there, in the sense that you de-emphasize the value of caregiving. And so that risk creating doctors that are very knowledgeable, but they're very poor at giving care.
Right.
So they're knowledgeable, but they are perhaps assholes because they're not empathic. Yeah. They don't understand that what they're saying may have an emotional impact on you way beyond, what you fathom, because you are fact-oriented and you sort of you want to sort this out, and you forget that it's a human being who's being given like a result of a scan or something and is just shook up. Yeah. So I think now that we're getting AIs into data-driven care system, the AI can do a lot of that information stuff when it comes to facts and factoids and mapping symptoms to possible underlying causes and da. And then the doctor or the caregiver will be asked to be more of a fellow human being with good, solid empathy in place, so that still relevant treatment protocol can be given to you in a more loving manner.
And also I think apply what humans can do really well, which is take some kind of piece of information and put it to the proper context and the background knowledge and the reasoning that humans have, which AI, at least today, is very far from having. So I think it's great. Let computers do the boring thing, which is going through a large amount of data, and then let humans use their intelligence and being able to reason about the context and the knowledge they have to really fulfill the task, the skill of building a treatment plan for a cancer patient or whatnot.
But this, what we talked about now, I think is quite profound, and you actually touched my heart, because both my parents are doctors. So I grew up listening to Latin at the kitchen table, right? 10 years old, they're working too much and they are going to night jobs and all, like what it means to become a doctor in their career, having children at the same time. And they are both retired at this point in time in life. And you know how you talk to your dad when you are grown up, and we can now talk about his career, we can talk about this. And this is one of the key things that we talk about, is that what is to become a really, really good doctor, or the best. He was a surgeon. He was not the best on sort of the all the facts and all that, but he was to take people, and actually really good with his hands. So my dad either wanted to become a carpenter or a surgeon, so actually the skills. And that will also be different when you have robotic skills like that. But I think this is so true, and it really re-emphasizes the whole education system.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Fundamentally.
So I certainly foresee a complete, reworking of the medical profession in terms of its education and how you sort of foster things.
And qualification.
First principles.
First
Yes.
principle.
There you have it.
Qualification of what makes a good doctor is essentially different.
Right. I remember I did a short stint at Lärarhögskolan, the University of Teachers, and as part of my studies, I guess. And I still recall the first day there. The teacher asked, what is the most important trait that a teacher has to you? Like, what do you think is the most important thing? And I was thinking, I need to come up with something really clever here. Like, what is it? And then it just struck me, like, if you can make people enthusiastic about the topic, that's it.
Touché.
That's it. Right?
I was wondering what you're going to ask as an old football, trainer and all that. This is the key.
Yeah.
How do I start the inner engine of a person to want to learn more?
Right.
That's your main goal.
Right. So it's not about you being enthusiastic about the subject.
It's not about you showing your
knowledge
supremacy. There's something else.
You want to seduce the other person into loving this thing, because through that love will come knowledge acquisition as a natural aspect.
I couldn't agree more.
So people need to want to learn, otherwise you can't really push knowledge into them, right?
It goes into anything. It's like this classic, how many hours do you need to put in to become a master of something? Football, AI, doctor. You need to love to put in the hours.
Right.
And this is so classical when you have children, right? And my children has been playing football, and all children are unique. And it's a good example, right? Like how one kid is sort of, he's a little bit into it, and he goes about it, and he's sort of grown more and more into it as older he gets. The second kid is, it's a social thing, don't really care. And then I have my youngest kid is an absolute football nerd, right? So it doesn't really matter when you're a young kid, and they have like 1 or 2 hours practice per week. Because he goes down with his friends to Värmdövallen, and I drop him off at 10 o'clock, and I can't get him out of there at 6 o'clock, And he spent, you will get good. Yeah. You will get really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that great, there's a great Alan Watts. I don't know if you like Alan Watts, but you should. It's mandatory to love Alan Watts. So Google Alan Watts. He was a professor in comparative religion, I guess. 50s, 60s on the West Coast. But regardless, he was also into Eastern religion, Zen Buddhism, and there's like a gazillion talks of Alan Watts recorded, and now they're all like floating around on the internet. But there's one great thing where he goes, my piece of advice to people in school, and he basically says, you need to figure out what you love. Mm-hmm. Once you figure out what you love, you go do that, and then the rest will follow. And Joseph Campbell had the same thing about follow your bliss, right? Mm. And he basically Alan basically goes, if you don't love what you do, you're not going to excel at it. Mm. But if you do love what you do, you will eventually master it, given your whatever constraints you have. But there is an element of fear associated to that, because if you love something that you think may be outlandish or not financially viable today, you may shy away from that. But Alan is basically saying, hey, if you love it, you're going to turn that thing into such an awesome thing that you're going to be able to commercialize it. Don't worry about it. But that faith in the victory of love over fear is not that easy to maintain.
Speaking about love and how to commercialize that, perhaps we lost the track a bit on Gepardy. And I'd love to hear how actually IBM was planning to actually commercialize that. And I know, but anyway. Perhaps we can get back to that, because I think a lot of people would like to hear the story. And just to finish off with Deep Blue a bit, and if that's intelligence or not, I certainly agree with what you said. If it looks like intelligence, it probably is intelligence. And even if it's a simple search algorithm that tries to do a lot of compute to come with a solution, it has the skill to play chess in some way, right?
Right. And exactly, and to return then to your initial question about, but what is more impressive, like beating a chess player, beating Go, or playing Jeopardy? And again, to return to that notion of what is possible, and once it turns out to be possible, you forget how impossible it seemed before it turned out to be possible. So then you sort of, immediately as it happens, you sort of devaluate that. So it's very difficult to put Jeopardy or Project Debater, contrast that to Deep Blue. I think they're all hugely impressive, and they just blow my mind. And and the moon landing as a grand challenge for IBM, and the computational stuff there.
And I really love, the quote I think Kasparov made after he lost against Deep Blue in '97. And he was really, knowledgeable person when it came to computer programming and AI, and how really Deep Blue
tackling, and answering the question whether or not.
And that was not for commercial reasons to begin with, at least, or.
Well, so the way, obviously IBM is a commercial engine, right? Yeah. But we also have a very large research institute, which has a history of churning out real proper research science.
Right. Which used to be patent leading stuff like this.
Right. And those efforts have scientific merits in their own right, outside or beyond any commercialability. Okay? But of course, there is a secondary agenda with this, and that is to sort of have scientific breakthroughs usher in new capabilities that we can then commercialize. So if you think of it as a pipeline for IBM, some of the things that research does will then be made hardened into products or assets and be stood up as offerings. And when in 2011 when IBM played Gepardy with Watson, it was basically a closed system, a standalone compute powerhouse with a lot of very, very interesting manipulations of a fairly small set of information. So people sort of think of that Watson Gepardy thing as just a very fast sort of online Googling of a problem, put as an answer, and then you figure out the question. But that is not the way it is, right? So what that is a parsing of human language and standing that up as a capability in a digital way.
And they had to do it the whole way, so to speak. They had to understand the speech, right? And they had to transform it to text. Or how did that process work?
Yeah, so in terms of the end result, that instance of Watson had to understand the answer, and then based on the knowledge base it had access to, which was quite limited. It was basically the wiki and some other data sets, but it wasn't the entire internet and then just quick search bar. But it had a lot of information in terms of trivia and stuff. But it had to figure out how to parse that answer and go parse the knowledge base to come up with the most likely question to be posed to match that answer based on what it knew. And then it had to do that sort of in a split second, because those really good players, they were quite fast. So it had to parse that.
And at that time, that was a problem. They had to use a lot of compute, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they really, I mean, so if you go to the Watson headquarters if you go to IBM Research, I think in New York, that's where you have the Watson instance that play Gepardy, and you can actually play Gepardy there.
Okay.
And I've taken clients there, and it's great fun. I mean, it's really, really still amazing.
Did you win?
No.
No way.
I think of myself as an intelligent person, but I'm a bit slow, so that doesn't work for me. But anyway, so it had to process that human language in a split second, and it had to self-assess what it thought was the correct answer. So it didn't take put money down basically and get it wrong. So it also had to score different alternatives and assess which is the most likely one. And how confident are you? Are you confident enough to actually press the button and give that question? And it was successful. And so that was a tremendous research breakthrough, which was just amazing. And then we stood up the Watson Group, and we started finding commercial applicability of those capabilities, like human language understanding and parsing of information and just open-ended unstructured data understanding. And then out of that, later on came various services and technology offerings. And today, most of the things that were in effect when we play Gepardy is available in one shape or form in various APIs that you can make use of the IBM cloud. So now we have sort of taken that on-prem Watson instance, we chopped it up into services, we stood it up on the cloud, and today the entire technological breakthrough that went into play to play Gepardy is just a subset of what is IBM's AI offering and what is being sort of put into the Watson brand.
I have to ask, as an AI nerd, and given the last years of breakthroughs in AI and NLP specifically, and at that time deep learning wasn't really a thing, and traditional NLP was a lot about like this kind of stemization and lemmatization and removing stop words and statistical approaches, and today it's all about deep learning. How much do you think they can reuse, so to speak, of the learnings from the Gepardy challenge to today's Watson systems?
Yeah, so we benefited hugely from that. So there's been a lot of the deep Q&A stuff that went into the Watson Gepardy instance. You see forming the basis of IBM's current Watson Assistant offering, which is basically the conversation service, or the chatbot, if you will. And also, if you've followed the development the recent past few years, you know IBM continued the work, and we have launched this IBM Project Debater.
Oh, I didn't know about that. What is that?
Yeah, so Google that, IBM Project Debater. So this is, we can take this many different ways, but basically it's a continuation of human language processing. And today there's a lot of talk of GPT-3 and all the magic it seems to be doing. IBM Project Debater, which was similarly as the Gepardy challenge, put out of, or taken out of the research, if you will, and we made a big splash, I think 2 years ago, when we stood up the Project Debater deep neural network technology in a human debate, where you had the one of the really great human debate champions debating Watson on a predefined topic. So we had I forget now which the initial one, but there was one in should I forget, but it's like should space exploration be subsidized, or you pick a topic, right? And then you train the IBM Project Debater neural network on that specific topic, and then you sort of sit back and you have the Project Debater debate the human. And
to what? Can you say that in advance that person should be for or against something?
Yeah. So you just you train the Project Debater on the topic to be debated, and then you say, okay, so you are for and you are against.
Oh, nice.
Then go hit it. And then if you look at some of these debates online, because this was I think 2 years ago, so it has matured into a very powerful thing. But of course, GPT-3 has taken all the limelight now recently. But I think.
So it's not like a Turing test in that sense. You shouldn't try to determine if it's a machine or not. It's really about trying to win a debate.
Yes, and the fun or the interesting thing with this is, you know how debate competition in the US is a big thing. It used to be the one thing. Now you have the flame wars on Twitter, which is a different thing. But anyway, the debate is a tried and tested
sport almost.
Sport and approach. And what you want is, you want to be successful in terms of not being right, but being convincing. And the way you're convincing is win the debate. Convince people that you are right and the other guy is wrong. And it's a neural network that you're squaring off against as a human. So when you can watch these debates, and there's been various versions of this. Most recently, I think it was part of the Cambridge Debate Society's competition, and it was supporting one of the teams. I forget the details of this. But if you check out IBM Project Debater, you will see some very interesting videos of neural networks spookily human-like in their discourse.
So, but even if we go into this topic immediately now, deep or not, we need to frame GPT-3 for the listeners, because we are now been throwing around this acronym. What is it?
Yeah. Okay. So they recently, before the summer, released one or the largest deep neural network ever released, and that was OpenAI, 175 billion parameters model. You need like hundreds of thousands of machines to even train it or use it, and it was trained in I shouldn't speak too much now. I can speak forever about this, but it was trained in a very simple way. It's a simple language model task, which is simply predict the next word. Given some piece of words, predict what the next one should be. That's it. That's the only thing, the objective it was trained on. And then a huge amount of data and a huge model that they use to train it. So simple task, but really big, both in terms of data and the model. And this one has some really nice properties, like it can do zero few-shot learning. You basically just start writing something, and you tell it to just proceed. And what you can do is, you can, for example, you write in natural language. You can, if you wanted to translate something, for example, you can just take the model as it is pre-trained. You say, translate from English to Swedish, and then you say beer, and it will answer öl in Swedish. So you can basically have it performing a large number of tasks with the same model without changing the weights in any way. And you can have it do many of these tasks without annotated data in any way. So it's unsupervised in that way, or self-supervised, I guess is a more proper term. So it moves towards this dream of general intelligence in the future, of course very far from having that, but it's really impressive what it can do without having annotated data and performing so many tasks with the same model.
Right.
What's the coolest examples that you... I've seen a couple of examples. Which one do you think is the coolest ones that sort of blows your mind?
There is this cool one. You can just say what kind of movies would you like, and you just write whatever kind of prompt in natural language, and it just from that understand these are probably the best movies you should watch. And it can basically list those movies, and it seems to understand in a creepy way, what the movies is about and what you mean, and then suggest that. It was really cool, I think.
What about you? Did you see some cool ones?
Well, so perhaps one should reference the Guardian article that was published like a week or maybe a couple of weeks ago, where the Guardian, the UK newspaper, there was this article there, which was written by GPT-3. And when you read it, it was like, oh, this is really coherent, like super interesting. How does this work? And then it turned out that they used GPT-3 in the same way as like the editors had used GPT-3 the same way they make use of journalists, basically saying, well, you are Mr. Journalist, go and write an article on this topic and hand it back to me by Monday, chop chop. And then GPT-3 went out and it wrote like 3 or 4 or 5 different articles, and then the editorial board sort of did a little bit of a cut-up work, and they sort of polished it up, as editors do with journalists. That's too wordy, that's a bit weird, and then out came this very cohesive, coherent text. And of course, if you market that as, ooh, look at this, the neural network can churn out the completely comprehensible, coherent and intelligent piece of writing on this topic, and it seems to be much more than, say, robot journalism churning out stats on a basketball game, then it feels, as you read it, to be human-like. And you're thinking, my God, this thing is intelligent. It can write, if not poetry, it can write, journalistic prose.
Yes.
But then the problem then in the sense of what is intelligence, is it intelligent, or in what way is it intelligent, is that people then go very quickly from the semblance of intelligence to thinking that, because the lights are on, somebody must be home. But there's nobody home. There's nobody home in GPT-3. There's no little gnome in there, doing things. No, it has the semblance. When it is successful, sometimes it will churn out using poppycock, and you read that, you go, nobody would write like this. So it's sort of a hit and miss thing. But regardless, it's a tremendously impressive pursuit of technology, and very interesting as a testing ground or battleground for some of these questions around natural language understanding. And it certainly raises questions about, in the era of digital fake news, deep fakes, what's going on, who's the sender, who's the receiver, what's the agenda, what is this used for? I read some article that somebody wanted to classify GPT-3 as a weapon, or it's but weapons of math destruction, right? So
yeah, and just to make it set the record straight a bit, there is so much hype around this model, and people think they can use it for anything, and it's super smart, and it's really not. There are so many examples where it completely fails to do many things. And even, for most tasks, it's much easier to find a single model that can do anything better than what GPT-3 can do. So I would...
Specific narrow task type model.
So, right. The thing that is impressive with GPT-3 is, from a more philosophical point of view, that this seamlessly simple approach of just scaling up things seems to work surprisingly well with a very single training objective. But it's not really practically useful. And I hope people understood that more, because we get so many requests, saying, "Can't we simply use GPT-3 for this?"
But I saw the cost when they commercialize this now. What's the cost of pushing GPT-3 to a certain topic? I heard like millions of pounds to get it started on in a context, or I don't know the details. I read something.
It's many millions of euros or dollars at least to train it. I think it's like if you take the one of the best GPUs, like the NVIDIA V100, I think you have to train it for 355 years or something.
Which sort of raises the element of energy consumption and climate impact of tech, right?
Yeah.
And I remember there was an article about OpenAI also. They did this great robotic arm, which could manipulate the Kubik's cube. I forget. Rubik's. I can never pronounce it.
Rubik's cube.
There you have it. And they were successful in terms of like dexterity of digits, but also visual recognition of what the cube was doing, and it was amazing, right? And then this guy was like, so what's the energy consumption here? and OpenAI was like, but then he sort of somehow calculated it and arrived at it's probably a couple of nuclear plants running full throttle for a couple of hours or days to just get that cube to be what's supposed to be. So of course, I mean, again, with the first principle or the viability or the implications of the technology or the scalability and the need for finding different approaches again surfaces.
It's also a question of moving from research to commercialization in some way, and sometimes OpenAI have perhaps moved a bit more into a commercial sector, but still they have very much a research focus, and there are, the main purpose is really to gain knowledge about how to do things. But still, it's an interesting thought. What is the reason for doing some type of research, and what really works if you want to commercialize it? And going back perhaps to Watson there, because I didn't think we tied the knot, so to speak, on that bag.
Let's do that.
And we had Gepardy. They were super successful. One of the seminal moments in AI in 2011, where they beat the human champion in Gepardy. And then I was using a lot of IBM tools before, like the SPSS statistic and data modeler and whatnot. And suddenly we saw this suite of Watson products and services coming up. So they seem to use that brand a lot, right?
Yes.
How does that work? What is the Watson brand today, you would say?
Yeah, so today there isn't really a Watson Group business unit, but there's a Watson brand, and that brand is being used for more or less everything AI-ish. But there are different ways of using that brand. So that you have certain corporations where you infuse some of the AI capabilities out of IBM into a offering, and then you can have maybe powered by Watson and stuff like that. But then also IBM has its own, the Watson Assistant, it's the conversation service. You have Watson Visual Insight. So basically, Watson is strictly used for AI, or what IBM defines as AI-related capabilities.
But more than text, it can be
certainly more than it could be anything. Yeah. So it can be any use of AI technology, visual inspection capabilities, audio acoustics, analytics, predictive capabilities in terms of vibratory analysis of auditory data to figure out, breaks of rails and stuff like that. So basically, IBM is using it should be using it as a vehicle and a brand for our AI offerings. I know that it was hugely successful 2011, and I think that made some of the offering managers at IBM very keen on using it, and perhaps it was overused in media and in communication. But I think IBM has reeled it in a little bit, and has started cultivating that brand a little bit more restrictedly.
So another topic we didn't really finish, speaking about intelligence, and IBM, at least before, used the term cognitive intelligence. What did they mean then, and what's the idea today?
So I think IBM was early on using cognitive technologies as our approach in cognitive business, and the cognitive enterprise was a.
And what do we mean with cognitive in this sense?
Yeah, so today we would talk about AI-infused capabilities, perhaps. But IBM would move away from the risk of being misunderstood and sort of moving away from the technical nitty-gritty nitpicking of definitions, like, is this really AI? Is this really ML? Is this an adversarial network? What is this? So they wanted to use something more business oriented and to show that the technological underpinnings of these capabilities may be of different kinds. But what we're trying to say is we want to usher in a sophisticated use of analytics and information management based on these technologies that other people talk about, used as AI, ML. There were a bunch, like 10 years ago, there were a bunch of different words being used. And IBM sort of, I think, stuck to cognitive because we wanted to stress the human-like element of the technology regardless of its underpinning. So again, is Deep Blue playing chess intelligent? Well, is it cognitive? Well, yeah, it's cognitive. It's thinking, but what is thinking? Well, are we interested in a theoretical, philosophical discussion about what is thinking, or do we want to say, hey, do you want to use these capabilities to improve your business results? So I think IBM wanted to move away from a technology focus to a business focus by using cognitive computing and cognitive technology. And then the cognitive enterprise became the label in which we sort of tried to work digital transformation projects infused by AI technology.
But I think this is also a little bit tricky. And maybe I'm opening this up too early, but I kind of want to go here a little bit with you, Peter. Is that I think there is a misconception what advanced analytics and using machine learning for, we had this conversation what a data scientist is versus a machine learning engineer. And there's a misconception of use cases here, how we can use machine learning for engineering purposes versus actually I'm here to really understand, the insight. Advanced analytics to me is different. And we are now basically ending up human-like insights where we have taken away the bias, which is advanced analytics is the word I would sort of frame this in. You can go much earlier into machine learning for some very concrete purposes, or vice versa. They aren't sort of, I would even argue mutually exclusive. Mm. Do you agree? Do you see what I'm trying to say here?
Absolutely. And I recall years ago, we used to talk about the maturation process from like analytics to predictive analytics to prescriptive analytics.
I've done this myself, the analytical ladder.
There you have it. Right?
Descriptive, diagnostic,
exactly,
predictive,
that whole thing.
Prescriptive, and which is sort of really. Then I've been part of this problem because I even done this ladder, right? And it's a little bit like people have heard this so much from Gartner, from all the management consultants. So we are confused here, I think.
Yes, and the bigger problem is when you create that nice ladder approach, you sort of invite an understanding of sequence. Mm-hmm. And it's like stepping stones and building blocks, and you begin with this thing, and then it moves to this thing, and then eventually you can optimize. And I think that's a simplification. And I think whereas relative each other, they sort of have a relative sophistication, if you will. Like, so it is more sophisticated. If you dare to be prescriptive and optimize a process based on a target, that is more impressive or more sophisticated than if you just describe what's going on. So if you have a rear view mirror BI solution, that is often less impressive than if you have a forward-leaning prescriptive, you should do this thing rather than that happened.
But this is different use cases.
Yes, so they don't. Yeah, so they don't build upon each other. And I think that's the sequential fallacy, if you will. You think you need to first put your information governance in place, and then you need to put your descriptive analytics in place, and then you can sort of slowly, move through the.
There are elements of truth in this. You need to have your data set, your data model, and then your analytical model. But in reality, I think this is very much misunderstood.
It is, and what I'm basically trying to say is, what you want to identify what you want to achieve. And then you bring to bear whatever you think is relevant for solving that or achieving that goal. And then you may have a little piece of information governance. You can have a little bit of Tableau visualization. You can have a little bit of sophisticated prescriptive analytics, CPLEX-based technologies, and you can have a little bit of predictive analytics using SPSS and you piecemeal it together. And then, you want some ML stuff? Fine. You want an adversarial network going in here? Yeah, maybe you could benefit from that. And so I think, whereas you do have to have, a good grasp of data management for sure, to be truly data driven and benefit from that.
So there's a foundation piece here that is relevant for all.
I think so, but I mean, it's not horizontally broad across the entire enterprise. It's not so that finance need to have their stuff in order for marketing segmentation to work.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think it's so common to hear, especially when you speak to companies, saying, well, we first need to build the data lake, we then need to build these pipelines, and then we need to build these dashboards, and then perhaps in a year or two we can start to use AI.
Right, and that's just tech enthusiasm being on display. Like, it's not why.
It's so wrong, I think, and I'm glad to hear that you think so as well.
I think Jeff Bezos of Amazon said it very well when he said, your margin, my opportunity.
Right.
Like, just attack where you see the slack in the system and just outperform them. So if you want to go sell books, go do that. You want to go into Whole Foods, you go do that. You want to do prefab housing and have Alexa be the voice of the house, you go do that. You're in the business of doing business.
But now we're getting into a topic where I think IBM as part of the industry is also part of the problem here. Because to some degree here, when I take the real tech companies, they fundamentally are so mature in understanding where is the slack in the system, number one. So they have this mindset, your margin is my opportunity. And then they have the know-how to pick this apart, to translate that to the fundamental bits and pieces, the piecemeal approach, and then surgically fix whatever they need fixing. Now, what I have felt, working a lot in the enterprise environment, is that basically, and I'm not putting the blame on one company, I'm thinking it's the industry as such, is that we have been driving this sort of hype type approach to technology. Somewhat, we all need to do big data. We have this all big data stuff. And it's a little bit like, actually, what are you trying to solve? And actually, wait, we are
First
talking
principles.
First principles.
We are talking about storage here, and how will that solve? How can big data? Well, you need the whole stack, by the way. So I think, and then this whole hype. First was big data, then it was something else, then it was something else, and what I'm trying to say is that coming in an enterprise setting where you simply don't have you don't really understand how it works, so you haven't been able to really pick apart the fundamental first principle of the problem, you are failing at basically utilizing all the brilliant technologies in the right way. And it becomes sort of this vendor versus this vendor or something like that, but not really even considering the fundamentals that you're saying. And I think this is something we need to figure out in the industry, that we are killing ourselves with hype.
Absolutely. And I think that the Gartner hype cycle is a very valuable tool to sort of call this out a little bit.
Yes.
And I think it's a means and an end discussion. And we if we like tech, we tend to sort of get very tech focused. Mm-hmm. And then you like one piece of tech as opposed to another, or you like one company's approach as opposed to another, and it sort of it misses the larger goal. And again, with the reflection of the first principle and the reason, your business reason or raison d'être, and I'm thinking of it in terms of in concrete terms, there needs to be a very solid approach to technology. And you need to have a very astute understanding of the possibilities of technology for you to be able to map those possibilities to the needs that you have as a business. But it needs to be business needs driven. But that may be more vague in terms of engineering science than technology. So we tend to sort of get pulled into technology. Think of the tendency for if you've been in large project deliveries or program deliveries, right? And the program or the project is starting to sort of face problems in terms of delivery or budget overruns or time overruns. There is a tendency to sort of cramp and look at the details, and you sort of, to try and fix the problem, you get dragged into the Excel and you try to figure out, oh no, it's this thing, and you start to micromanage things because you're being concerned about the bigger outcome of the program. But that is the complete incorrect approach. You don't go in and micromanage your way out of a project that is derailing. You need to lift your gaze and look at, but what is it that we actually need to do to get there?
I think that's a good point, and we have a lot of topics that would be nice to cover, like philosophy kind of questions that I know you love, and psychedelics perhaps, and whatnot. But just to close the point perhaps about analytics, AI, how companies can get started. If you were to recommend a company, let me just take an example. You can choose another example if you prefer, but let's say some retailer or a company that now becomes increasingly scared when Amazon is launching in Sweden soon, and feel like, okay, we really need to step up here to be able to have a chance against Amazon and use data and AI properly. How would you recommend them? Let's say that they don't have that much digitalization. They have some, of course, some web analytics and whatnot, but how would you recommend them to proceed? It's a general question, I know, and feel free to change it if you want. But
yeah, it's an interesting and difficult question, and there's a reason why there's a whole slew of consultants out there pushing and consulting services to help you with this. How do you tackle Amazon? It's a very interesting question because once we go digital, we basically level the playing field and we create a single market. I know the European Union has this single digital data market. Yeah.
Should be called digitized market, but it's called digital market.
and really, digitalization and the digital infrastructure backbone creates the single global market, and on that market there's an upside to data richness. And once you sort of establish a certain amount of sort of hegemony in terms of data ownership, or once you have a powerful enough position in terms of your data, you become very difficult to face, simply because you can just out data drive the competition. So if you are a smaller actor on that same single global digital market, you really need to find ways of not brute forcing your attack on Amazon or on the competition. You really need to sort of think about it differently in terms of what is the value add that you can bring forth that Amazon can't. And it may have to do with brand perception. Perhaps retail or consumers are not pro Amazon because Amazon has a poor working policy ethics. So maybe you would prefer, maybe you could buy the thing from Amazon or the thing from the other place, and that but they don't give their employees minimum wage in a way that they can sustain their business. I'm going to go here. So you could play that angle, but you need to find a way of getting on the digital landscape. You cannot not be there for sure. But you just need to think differently about things. I don't really have a good prescriptive approach to this. I'm very concerned about the data tech giants. What do they call them? The big six or the big
GAFA companies?
Maybe the GAFA company. Yeah. So that's a great concern for me. And I read a very interesting piece on, because of technology's impact on the world and how and the speed it has impacted the world. Regulatory mechanisms haven't been able to mitigate or deal with this fact, right? So there's been old hat thinking coming up against the digital onslaught of people going online. So therefore, if you look at how did Google or Amazon, if you will, rise to power? How did that happen? Well, a lot of it happened through acquisitions and mergers and acquisitions, and they just merge, and eventually they were super big. And when they were super big, super data rich, getting more data rich all the time, now we have a problem that is evident to everybody. But it was evident to other people early on. but they weren't able to articulate it in a way that made it possible for regulators to say, well, what about antitrust? What about competition? What about that unique position? How do we deal with that? So now I think we're in this very challenging times where we've ended up in a situation that wasn't clear to a lot of people, but it was clear to Jeff Bezos. It was clear to Zuckerberg. It was clear to some really clever people that got on the digital data train early. And they've just been chewing at full throttle out of station for a long time. And it's very difficult to catch up.
So would you say, are you optimistic or pessimistic to how to compete with Amazon, for example? Do you think like a small Swedish retailer have a chance to actually compete with them?
I would like to think so. I'm concerned. I think there is a risk of poorness of choice, if you will. I think the selection or the alternatives. Like, there's a reason why we have antitrust laws. I mean, we like to see a healthy competition on a level playing field, and it's difficult to tell. What was it, Microsoft who ended up in this case some years ago? They wanted they were growing too big in some area.
Explorer problem, perhaps.
Yeah, the Explorer Netscape thing.
Operating system.
Operating systems, perhaps.
Or Explorer, or the Explorer maybe.
Yeah,
could they embed the Explorer, the web web browser?
Could they offer that for free as a part of the operating system? Yeah. And they couldn't, or they could, I forget. But anyway, these types of problems are acute and they need to be dealt with. So although I think of myself as an anarchist at heart, I sort of want to sort of pull the lifeline of regulatory governance onto the market and say, hey, this doesn't work simply because it's not beneficial to the many. It's beneficial to the few. Yeah, and I think we see that being played out in, the personal wealth of
and the tricky part, as we also highlighted, I think, in the last interview, is that the current regulatory field actually plays in the hands of the GAFA companies, because they now have the fundamental legal power, technology know-how to understand and manage and be compliant with the current regulations, which is for a less mature company really difficult, because they don't really understand how to deal with it. So it's actually right now not the intended purpose is good, but who's really hurting in terms of acceleration or slowing down, it's actually really serious.
The opposite effect, yeah.
It's the opposite effect.
Yeah, it is. And I'm thinking of, to return to the question of intelligence, I think, and education, I think this is where the need for both come into play. We need to have conscious consumers. We need to educate people about the fact that their choice matters. It matters if you vote or you don't vote. It matters who you vote on. Your actions have implications. The energy consumption of the data storage centers have an impact if you are online all the time. And I think when people that like market economy, they always say, but the market will self-regulate and da-da-da. And sort of theoretically, I guess that is sort of true. But it's not true when you have intelligent people and stupid people. You need to have intelligent people across the board, and people need to be invited to become intelligent or digital savvy. And I don't really think that we see those initiatives enough. And I think we certainly should. I think Ralph Nader, if you recall him, he was really good at raising or creating this conversation around civic and corporate society, and the dangers of giving corporations fact that you can have a distinction between people who actually have power to decide and the responsibility that they should shoulder based on that power. So you have, on the one hand, you have Mark Zuckerberg, who can actually himself just decide things, that relates to Facebook, because he has that power within that organization. And that's one guy, and it will impact a whole lot of people in a whole lot of ways. And you have to ask yourself, is this what we want? Maybe it is, but if it's not, we need to work to change that.
But it comes back to the whole do we regulate regulate the technology or do we regulate the usage of it? This is your pet philosophy.
Yeah,
I think this is really
regulation
true.
is a super boring topic, but super important.
Yeah,
and I think a common misconception is that you should regulate technology itself rather than the use, the effect of it, and that's a very dangerous thing to do.
And you always like to bring the example, well, what we do with data in the public sector or with health data compared to what we do in data in terms of selecting the right music, it has different consequences, how bad, how dangerous it is. Sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to work sort of the end game, or we need to work change over time or over generations. So it's very difficult to effectuate horizontal change brutally or forcefully. So if you come down and say, now all of a sudden we realize that we need to chop up Google and create 10 separate companies and they can have the same owner structure, that's very difficult to sort of make happen. But if you say, if you educate people over time in the sense that, they need to become digitally savvy, you will have impact over time. But if you have a lot of stupidity out there, that won't happen. So think of, the Black Friday videos you see where people are just storming, Walmart and, fighting and they want the cheap microwave. I mean, that mentality is not a very sustainable mentality for the great future that we could actually stand up if we so wanted to. Because that's just an unfortunate consequence of the educational and economic system that has been in place for a long time. That gives that. And then to say, you cannot discount stuff that much because people become crazy, that won't work. So I think you need to sort of attack the problem over time and think, the old guys won't be around for so long, but the younger generation is coming up strong, is coming up fast, and tech adoption and tech usage is going down the ages. And the younger people are the future, so you need to sort of get at them, and you do that through enthusiastically triggering them.
But now we can circle all the way back that if we want to educate people, and we see competence is one of the major issues here in terms of the regulators not understanding and knowing this. I think the whole industry hype story is the problem that, yes, the industry is talking about these new technologies, but they're talking to the IT department, and the business department don't know, and then the IT department don't know the business. So we are back to this number one pedagogical goal, to create the internal engine of people, regulators, business leaders to learn, to really dip their hands in here.
Yes, and I think... just look at the impact of Greta on the environment.
The Greta effect.
The Greta effect, right? But so think about that. Up until Greta came along, most people were like, awesome, I can fly to Dublin for $1. Phenomenal, I'm going to go do that. And it's like, how could it be so cheap? But what do you think? How can it be cheaper to, import organic honey from Argentina compared to like having locally sourced bee honey, and all these economic systems? They say something about how we are being, how we sort of act out, or how we sort of behave. Mm-hmm. So, and you can if you inform people about their consequences, you can change them. And Greta came along and said, hey, this whole flying thing, it creates a problem for us. And then all of a sudden people got into this flygskam thing. And like, I used to sort of, blog all the time about, I'm flying there, the frequent mileage. And all of a sudden it became like, don't do that, man. That's just
I think this is a great example, because we were a bit negative, I think, speaking about how should we have a chance against Amazon. Let's just go back and die.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Regulation
we need to have
boring.
Fun, we need to have enthusiasm. It also needs to reflect on the vlog, yeah?
Yeah, I just like to try to bring some more optimism into this discussion. And certainly. I think the Greta is a perfect example of that the small one can actually move giants. And I remember some talk or some quote from Google, and they asked, aren't you afraid about Apple and Amazon and how you're going to compete with the big giants? And he said, no, you're not really afraid of them. We are really afraid about the small startup that has done something we haven't thought about. And that is really what the main challenge is. And I would say it is certainly possible, even for a small Swedish retailer that is perhaps feeling a bit scared right now, if they actually do have a first principle thinking, starting to digitize properly, to very much have a big chance against Amazon.
I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's the whole flipping this whole into passion, and like, you know, it's a little bit like, are you gonna go home and die because there's a new competitor coming to the market, or you basically say, shit, I need to beat these guys at their own game. Take that as a challenge. Go home, find your first principle, figure out exactly what this is all about, finding your niche, whatever it is, how you need to do it differently. But don't lay over and die. I mean, like the whole COVID situation, I think it's, in a lot of ways, a very crazy situation and a lot of frustration and hardship at work. But at the same time, a lot of positivity in terms of, let's just get this done. Let's just figure something new out. And I think that's where this needs to go, that don't be scared. Put your mind into learning. Put your mind into figuring this out. What is your first principle?
Absolutely. And you're certainly right. I mean, the great thing with the digital world we're creating is that if we can just get more and more people into it, we will have more and more brains connected. And those brains will come up with really fun things that we don't ourselves think about. So there's, you know how people say, oh, but diversity is so important for innovation. You need to have diverse teams. And you need to have different angles. You need to think outside the box and all of this thing.
Adaptability and efficiency.
But that is true. And the great promise of the digital world is that you can move people globally. You know, you can actually have an impact on everybody. Everybody's online. If you're successful on TikTok, boom, you know, you're done. You can impact everybody. Everybody does your dance all of a sudden. You're like, yeah, man, that's what I did. I created the need for doing that. And you can have things go viral. And that is true of the unforeseen or the unthought of also. So whereas we old guys sit here and say, oh, what are we going to do with this thing? There's some kid someplace, you know, he has already figured this out. He's just not, you know, hasn't the entrepreneurial program yet because he's 12 years old. But, you know, give him a couple of years, get him into the incubator, and boom, you know, Amazon is out.
Or even if Amazon is not out, you will learn how to coexist. You will learn how to flip what you thought was the biggest threat into, okay, how do I play in this market now? Because all of a sudden, the main topic is that, hey man, this is not a Swedish market. I guess you have woken up today that this is a global market. So how you define your market, how you define your distribution, everything, we have had a constraint based on the analog's view of transportation, of logistics, of our market, which is gone. And I think, so if you take that, oh my God, it's gone. I could sell to anyone. Okay, but how do I do that? And how do I think that? And how can I piggyback on Amazon in some ways to be my niche on some other way? I don't know. I mean, like,
absolutely. And what is interesting with the digital landscape is that it can be a level playing field.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a level playing field, but it can be. But to return to my stint at ATG, the betting company, what was interesting with that company or that situation was that being if not state-owned, then state regulated betting company, they had a huge taxation obligation. So in order for them to be allowed to conduct betting, they had to sort of feed the state with, I think it was like for some products maybe 30% of the turnover of that product needed to go into the state. And of course, if you think of the casinos in Las Vegas, right, they have a payout of 98.5% or something. They give back, or keep the service provider keeps 1.5%. So if you on the one hand have regulatory or regulated actors that are bound with their hands behind their back in terms of what they need to pay back, they can't have the same lucrative payout to the players. So therefore, somebody comes along and says, hey, you know, if you play with our casinos instead of that casino, you will get much more back. So I will go there. And then it's not a level playing field because the rules of the game is different. And we can sort of use that analog, that comparison when it comes to globalization and the production of manufactured goods. And you think about the traditional way of doing it, where you say, I want to produce something where it's cheap to produce, and I want to sell it where it's expensive to buy. And then I just move that thing around. But if you do level the playing field, it will be the same cost structure all over, because the minimum wage will be the same. The job security will be the same for everybody. So if you could force through regulation, like a minimum wage payout from Amazon, their opportunity for getting at that margin will be less, because they have to behave more similar to others if you want to. But if you don't want to, you don't have to go there. But that's one way of looking at what the digital landscape can offer in terms of thinking differently about globalization and the global market.
And speaking about thinking differently and promoting innovation, let's jump to one of your other very favorite topics, perhaps, psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yes.
What time is it? You know,
time for rock and roll at 7 o'clock.
Minutes. Yeah, is Goran okay with this?
Yeah, we can go on.
But in order to talk psychedelic, I need more beer.
I was interested to see, you wrote about this. Can you just describe your passion for that and what it really is for people that doesn't know, and how does it work?
Yeah, so when it comes to psychedelics, people traditionally have equated it with drugs, and drugs are bad. And we've all watched South Park, Mr. Mackey, drugs are bad and gay, and and especially in Sweden, there's been a stigma around drugs, and people are very sort of shy about this. And traditionally, it's been like career suicide to even go there. And if you want to do research, even if you're interested in the human mind, the body-mind dilemma, and you want to sort of pursue this, and especially like we're sitting here talking about artificial intelligence, we're asking ourselves, what is intelligence? All of these questions relate to the human condition in one way or the other, as do psychedelics. So today we have sort of seen the resurgence of psychedelic research over many, many years. There used to be initially, like before the hippies and Timothy Leary turned the whole thing into a youth movement and anti-establishment thing, there was actually good, solid scientific research being done into the era and the benefits of it. And it really showed how you can use how you can explore the workings of the mind in a biological, chemical way. And I think...
so what happens to the mind when you...
what happens to the mind? Ask Professor David Nutt. I don't know. But what just to sort of just introduce the topic, because it may seem off topic for an AI conversation, but I don't think it is. Yeah. I think technology forces us to reflect upon what it means to be human. And I think humans have... The reason why humans aren't like other animals is because of our relationship to technology. Right. So we are technological creatures in a much different way than other animals. And for some reason, the primates figured this out. If you watch the Stanley Kubrick movie, it was because the iPhone 5 came from space and they turned the monkeys into humans through the relationship they struck with technology. Who knows, right? I mean, he was an interesting guy. But anyway, so if you want to reflect upon intelligence, the human condition, then I think psychedelics is an invitation to that. And I think the recent resurgence these past 20 years into the topic have really shown the merits of it. And I think if you look at some of the mental health issues that result from our perhaps over-technologification of the human condition, we need to find ways of dealing with that. And I think psychedelics, if you look at the research coming out of Johns Hopkins, seems to suggest that there is certainly validity to some of that early research done prior to the thing turning into an anti-establishment, anti-war, anti-system youth movement.
And how would you define the movement of psychedelia or this today? I mean, because we all have this view of what you highlighted, how it went about in the 60s and the 70s, but where is the research or the movement or the emphasis? So 2020.
So basically, if you there's a very credible journalist called Michael Pollan. He wrote the book about the psychedelic renaissance. He was invited to the TV4 TV Soffa. He's been making the tours around the world with his book, and that is just sort of the most recent example of legitimization of the topic. So today, I think we're seeing a more sort of a less ideologically fear-based approach, attitude to this. So if I had said, hey, let's talk about psychedelics 20 years ago, it would probably not have gone so well, because people have just, been, oh, you're a drug addict, terrible person, and, go.
In the psychedelic winter, yeah?
Absolutely. That's great. I'm going to take that. That's great. But anyway, but recently then we've seen the merits of this, and there's a very interesting clinical trial being conducted now by an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Research, headed out by Rick Doblin. There's an institute called the Hefter Institute, which funds a lot of this research. And everything is done, or the things that are being done in the US are being done within the system. It's not like rogue scientists cooking up, Breaking Bad type stuff in the basement. And that's not what's going on, right? This is legit stuff. Today, Johns Hopkins is sort of famous for being the COVID data center of the world, right? And they are also the ones that are churning out perhaps the most interesting research in psychedelics. So it's legitimate research. I just want to stress that, because people just think, you're space cake for talking about it. But I think the work, the clinical trial the MAPS is doing today centers around MDMA, what people think of as ecstasy, and they go fucking do raves in Docklands in the UK way back. But they have shown that if you combine MDMA as a chemical substance with proper therapy, you can address very successfully post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And they've done this successfully. So therefore, they've moved up the ladder, and they're now doing the phase 3 clinical trials. So this is going to go and become legit. You're going to go. It will be possible within a few years to take MDMA in a therapeutic setting, just like that. Like as if you were to take serotonin take inhibitors, right? So it's just going to be another technology. And I think that's the great promise, right? There are other approaches to dealing with problems. I mean, first principles, new ways of dealing with old problems, and it's just, I'm very happy for the change in culture and the restoration of the allowance for science to conduct research. I mean, when the hammer came down in the late 60s, it just forbade science to go there. All of a sudden, science couldn't be scientific because the ideology said, no, you can't go there. And it was very strange, because that happens very rarely. I mean, science will grow human ears on the backs of mice and be happy with that. And, we'll do all the weird things, right? Because it's science. But for some reason, or for obvious reasons, they just shut that down. And we have sort of lived in the psychedelic winter up until the 90s, when Rick Strassman got the thing going, really.
And for people like myself that don't really know that much about it, what would you say, besides PTSD and that type of disorder, how can it benefit people in some way?
So when this topic surfaced again as a legitimate avenue for research, people were very sensitive how to structure this. Mm. So, and the way to progress in the field was sort of, well, if you have made psychedelics illegal because they're dangerous, then you can't just all of a sudden do research on healthy volunteers because that's a conflict with the ideology that made it illegal. So you need to find another user group. Mm-hmm. So they decided on the terminally ill. Mm-hmm. And they said, hey, if you're going to die anyway, you might as well take some psychedelics and see what happens. That's fine, right? So the initial studies were around ease of anxiety facing death in terminally ill patients. Right. And that was successful. So they showed that you could, if you gave terminally ill patients that were afraid of death psychedelics in a therapeutic setting, and you worked with it in a careful way, you could actually have these people have a better transition into death because the fear was gone. So that's one application that was early on proven out. But then there are other areas such as addiction treatment. Mm-hmm. And people may say, oh, but wait a minute, drugs are addictive. You're going to treat addiction with addictive substances. How does that work? Well, it works through the fact that psychedelics aren't addictive. And there's a naivete around addiction. And I think Sweden's strong ideological basis or critique of certain areas haven't helped. And I think Sweden has been proven wrong in our approach. And I think that's the reason why we're seeing the resurgence of this, because the science is solid. And the great thing with science is that it will just push and push and push. And if something is not valid, it will just self-destruct because it won't hold up, right? But if it's actually effective, then it will be proven out over time. And I think that's what we're seeing. The most, I think, interesting area though is in terms of impact on human psychology and the positive impact it can have on perceived value of life. So when they do these self questionnaire studies on, and Johns Hopkins did this, they gave people a pretty hefty dose of psychedelics. They like a single dose of hefty, proper dose, and they had a therapeutic session. They had a protocol where they sort of there was a method to the madness, right? And then they just hit the volunteers with psychedelics, and then they worked under this during the session, and then after the session, they could see that there was a spiritual impact on people. So people perceived the experience as the most important experience of their lives compared to the birth of their first child, the death of their mother, and it lasted. So Johns Hopkins could show that if you program people through therapy, going into the experience and coached and had a protocol for the session, and then dealt with the outcome of the session, you could have lasting positive impact on your life. It could open up a greater sense of value and appreciation for the human condition. So that to me is the real kicker here, because when we talk about artificial intelligence and AI, ethical AI for good, we're talking about poor behavior during Black Friday, and I mean what we want is, and we talk about education. Basically, what we want, what I would like to see is a restoration of the appreciation of the human potential. That's why I'm interested. I'm interested in how AI can augment people. I'm interested in how AI can, to return to the doctor thing, how AI can help doctors be given the opportunity to be better at being fellow human beings without losing the expertise. So the way I see AI augmenting, like technology augmenting humans, I see, psychedelics can, help augment people as well in the same way. So to me, basically, psychedelics is just another, to quote Merceliade, another technique of ecstasy. There are many techniques, and you can go about change in many different ways, and psychedelics is just one. You don't need to take drugs to have a spiritual experience, but you can take drugs and have a spiritual experience, and that to me is mind blowing. How can that be, right?
It's just another example of how fascinating the human mind is and how little we actually know about it, and still try to build intelligence in an artificial way, so to speak, and often try to claim at least that we copy the human brain, which we rarely do, but still, if we can, we know all the disorders and problems that the human brain has, anxiety and whatnot, and that it's possible to actually impact how the brain works with, for example, this type of technique, if you call it that,
right,
is interesting in itself, right? And if we think about data and AI, we have problems with biases and data, and perhaps there are some lessons that we can learn also for how we can modify the brain. Perhaps we can modify also AI and learn something from this. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that technology holds up a mirror against us, and we reflect ourselves through our technology. So when people are, upset about how Trump uses Twitter, but they were fine with Obama using Twitter, that says something about the person using the technology, and it amplifies the personality. So it holds up a mirror. So if you want to sort of educate somebody about what's Donald Trump all about, well, go read his tweets, and you will get a fair understanding of what the man is up to. And you can do that with anything. And the same is true of psychedelics. Psychedelics really hold up a mirror onto yourself, and you can look at that. And we talked about, the reflective endeavor of self-understanding. And I think that is very true. And one other thing that relates to the field of AI and the bias question is that psychedelics dissolve bias like nothing else.
Really?
Like nothing. There, you can, if you have a fundamentalist approach to things, and you come out of a properly executed psychedelic therapeutic session, those biases will most likely not be there anymore. Because what you thought were true is not true. It's perhaps true, but it's perhaps not true. And that in itself has great value.
Sounds like a perfect tool to do first principle thing.
Well, I think there's a reason for Steve Jobs writing positively about LSD in his autobiography, right? Yeah. And people are like, oh, but that's just Steve Jobs. He's like unique. That doesn't relate to the rest of us. But it does. It relates to everybody. And then you can spin this many different ways, and you can make the case, and you can argue for this and that way. But the interesting thing today is that we have the technology to assess some of the mechanics of the workings of the psychedelics, which makes it less of a gray area. So, for instance, if you look at some of the research that Professor David Nutt in the UK did early on, you could see that there was an impact of how the brain actually worked and how the two halves interacted with each other just by having people take psychedelics and put them in an MRI scan. One of those brain scans. And so you can see, okay, interesting. So that guy on psychedelics' brain looks a little bit more like Einstein's brain, because Einstein's brain famously, they sliced it and they looked at it. And one of the things that they came up with was, there are more connections in between various parts of the brain when it comes to Einstein. But that is true of your condition when you're on psychedelics. But anyway, you should, because it's such a hot topic in
controversial,
but it's also hot. I mean, if you have Michael Pollan sitting in the TV4 TV-soffan talk about this, then something has happened. I mean, because Beatrice Ask, and Maria Larsson, and some of the politicians in Sweden that have been like waging a war against this would never allow this. But today, you have a lot of interesting science backing a lot of their claims out, and a lot of understanding is being brought forth that explains some of the effects that you saw early on. But you couldn't really sort of explain it in a scientific way, and that made it impossible to build credibility. But now, when you have even KI doing some interesting work in the field, something has happened.
If someone listening to this would like to learn more about it, what would you recommend them to read or do?
Well, Terence McKenna always said that the first stop on the psychedelic journey is the library.
Okay.
And I think a good place to start is read Michael Pollan's book, The Psychedelic Renaissance. I mean, it's a pretty good overview of things. And I think, so that's good. And then also, I think, don't be afraid of reading some of the research on it. I mean, at least read the abstracts. And if you find a specific use case, if you will, that appeals to you, go explore that. And also, I think this should be sort of talked about or seen in the light of, the different view today on cannabis and that whole legal status and the health merits or not of it, because that has also changed tremendously. So there's a much greater permission today to have this conversation and to give thought to this as a possibility.
Awesome. I think the time is flying away very quickly.
The time is flying. The time is truly flying.
And we should try to start to wrap up a bit. But perhaps, Patrick, if you were to talk a bit about what's going on right now in your life, your plans ahead, or what would you say?
Well, these are interesting times. Now, so we stayed away from U.S. politics today, which I think is perhaps
so many
good.
other topics. I wish we had time. Philosophy would be awesome
for sure.
to speak about. But yeah,
absolutely. But so, what in terms of what goes on in my life, I think that so I became a dad a year and a half ago, so I have this
congratulations.
small little
Yes.
kid, and I'm just in love with him, and it's great, and it changes me in many wonderful ways. It also makes me think of something that somebody told me that Don Olsson of Stena Group said. I don't know if he said it, but somebody said that he said it. And he said his thinking is a 60-year game plan, because it's a family-run business, and he's thinking about his grandchildren. That's his horizon. So it's not a quarterly-based revenue attitude. It's sort of like a long-term thing. And I think psychedelics, as well as becoming a dad, certainly extends the horizon. Like, I want to see Armageddon postponed. And so I'm a little concerned about the U.S. political situation and what will unfold there, and how it will impact work, life, climate, but at the same time...
That's a super interesting topic. I mean, you have an American background as well, so that would have been nice to be able to talk about. But we are going to continue the discussion afterwards. That's going to be the real interesting
Goran,
stuff, I think.
to involve you in the conversation, I guess we need to figure out how to do this with guests or people joining the after work. At some point in time further down this series, so people can experience.
We have one guest today.
We have one guest today already. We had a couple of. We've had guests actually every session.
I think so
far.
Coming in, yeah.
We'll see how we do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
But I have another question for you.
Shoot.
Or who should we invite? Who are great guests to invite?
Yes, there's one guy you should invite. You should invite a guy called by the name of Corey Robinson. I think he's
Here in Stockholm?
I think he's in Linköping. I forget.
Corey
Robinson. I can send you the name. He's an interesting guy. He's an American, but he's moved to Sweden, and he is a researcher at the university. I forget, but he just launched this data privacy initiative, and I think he's a very interesting guy. If you want to talk about data integrity, the concerns about privacy, and how a data-driven society risk violating some of the fundamental rights of individuals to be private. I think he has a very sophisticated thinking around this.
Very cool.
And he's steeped in, I don't know if you're familiar with the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and the stuff that they do. But I think Corey Robinson would probably be an interesting chat. It's not necessarily AI heavy, but this is data heavy and integration.
Data and AI first society topic.
Yes, and if you think about all the questions around surveillance problematics, if you think of contact tracing in COVID times and their implications or risks for individuals, and the misuse of power that comes with the information society, or if you think about the risk of relying too naively on algorithmic decision making, and all the problems that we've seen in terms of biases being played out in all these weird ways, where you have racism rampant, or it's not racism, but it's the semblance of racism, or the practical implications is there. Then I think Corey Robinson would be certainly an interesting guy.
And speaking about another topic we didn't have time to discuss was quantum computing as well.
Quantum computing.
Yes.
Yeah, and IBM does a lot of this. I mean, quantum computing is a big bet for IBM, but I'm not the guy to talk quantum computing with at IBM. But there is a guy, Mikael Haglund, who's one of our CTOs, and he is a very good, knowledgeable person when it comes to quantum computing. So if you want to know whether or not there will be millions of qubits available in the near term, or what the 1,121 qubits promised by IBM to be around 2023, recently announced.
So it was a news article just recently released, right?
Yes, so IBM released our roadmap for quantum computing 2 days ago. And made that announcement where we said, by 2023 there will be 1,121 qubit power available for use. If you want to have that conversation, Mikael Haglund for sure. And I think that the whole field of quantum computing really returns us to the first principle question.
Yes.
And let's just rethink the whole thing.
Rethink the whole thing.
And then
And they-
finally, I guess one guy that you might want to talk to is a guy called Ashkan Fardost. I can never pronounce his name, but Ashkan anyway. He's a very interesting man, and he is one of the better, the more interesting speakers on the digital revolution, if you will. So he's a very interesting guy. He's out there a lot, talking a lot, and he has a lot to say about digitalization and the implications of it. So there you have three.
And then I must ask another thing.
Those are all dudes. I should
Dude,
really,
What happened there, man?
Yeah, sorry about this. Let me immediately correct that. And also, you should invite Danica Kragic if you haven't done that already. Anna Fellender is always interesting to listen to.
Yeah.
So those are two great women in tech.
Great.
I know you are, you have a philosophical side, but also you are one of the guys that I read on or listen to on some frequent basis. You do small vlogs, you do blogs. What is your purpose? Why do you do that?
What is my purpose?
Yeah, with this point.
We need some psychedelics, I think, for this one.
Yeah, Terence said, the human mind needs pharmacological intervention to fix us, to restore us into the guy.
No, but everything like this takes time, and we sit
Yes.
here, we do this on our spare time with a quite clear passion and purpose. What is yours?
But I'm passionate for the possibility that the internet brings, broader. But I think there's a risk of a co-option of the whole field, and I think we need to sort of take it back. I mean, I sort of think of it similarly to you remember the situation a couple of years back in Sweden when, or many years back, I guess, there was this conversation in media about the use of the Swedish flag and how we couldn't. Should we really use the Swedish flag?
We need to retake it to. Why we need to be like this. You talk about this whole industry.
Yeah, we need to be proud of what the Swedish flag can represent in terms of the Swedish culture and what we have to bring forth. I mean, the public access, the allemansrätten, the public access right to land, or offentlighetsprincipen, the public access to information. All of these great things that we sort of embed, or we can embed into the Swedish flag symbol. We should take it back, and we should say, you guys can't have it. We're going to have it.
And you want to take that stuff back when it comes to technology.
Yeah, so I think we should again. I mean, it was good that you turned this whole bleak thing about Amazon around into something more positive, because there is a lot of possibility there. But if we limit ourselves to the echo chamber of our own curated news feeds on various social media platforms, we will not see the potential of the thing. We will just see a reflection of some of the algorithms playing out recommendation games on us, and it will look pretty bleak, because I will flip through US political news and we just go like, Jesus Christ, this will never work. And so I'm out there to just give another voice.
And what is your key message? What are you trying? What do you want to say? If how? Because I feel the same. You do things, you vlog, you do things, but ultimately there is a key message you want to convey. What is your key message?
I think my key message is perhaps to end on a quote by George Clinton of Funkadelic and Parliament fame, and he said, "You meet in life the exact reproductions of your own thoughts. So be careful of the thoughts seeds plant in the garden of your mind, because seeds grow after their kind."
Oh, cool.
And so I think we should really feel that we do have the power to define our own reality, and that's my key message. You can be the not only the hero of the novel of your own life, but you could be its author. Truly, you can.
Fantastic.
And nobody can tell you otherwise. If they do, they can.
Let's all go out and be the authors and heroes of our own life.
Yeah, for sure. Bring it forth. And when we do, I have a basic, solid opinion or view of people being good people.
Yeah.
I think people are idiots because of poor circumstance.
Or knowledge, or situation, context.
Yeah, so I think if you just allow people to be themselves, you feed them, you clothe them, you take care of them when they're sick, then people will be really nice guys, really nice people. It's only if you take away that you will have, the Black Friday mentality putting forth and center. So we don't want that. So we want, you know, the what was it that George said about the Funkadelic is one who's dedicated to the feeling of good, you know. But then again, how can something so bad feel so good? So I don't know. I don't know.
Awesome. It was a true pleasure to have
you.
you on this show, and I'm sure we meet again sometime soon.
I certainly hope so, for sure, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Very nice. Cool.
There were some technical glitches as well, so we got like a couple of times the streaming fell down and etc. So definitely some of the points we need to repeat, and it will be interesting actually to continue this with a couple of different questions as well that we didn't focus on this time, I think.
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah. Good.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Take care.
We good?
We're all good.
Good.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap.
It's a wrap.